Hey, my name's Paul. I'm the education coordinator at Film Streams in Omaha, Nebraska. Let's talk about film. Let's jump right in and set up a goal here. I want this video to contribute to a better contextual understanding of Indigenous people of Latin America and how the world sees them through film. How are we going to do this? Well, we're going to look at films about the Indigenous people of Latin America and pay special attention to how these films represent the effects of colonialism, Indigenous women, the aging population, and poverty. I want to talk about some definitions really quickly. The way that I'm using Latinx signifies any person of Latin American origin or descent. Latinx is related to the gendered terms Latino, which is masculine, and Latina, which is feminine. Latinx is used to include gender nonconforming people into a term of identification that has been historically binary, either male or female. Latinx is relatively new and can be used by people who might want to move away from a traditional understanding, a binary understanding of gender. In the context of Latin America, terms like Latino, Latina, and Latinx are products of colonialism. These are all Spanish terms, and Spanish was one of the many things that was institutionalized by Europeans during colonization. While the term Latinx is aimed at inclusion, it's also impossible to remove Latinx from the history of colonization. My attempt at using it was to include all genders into this discussion, but also in doing so, I'm using a word built by colonialism. Colonialism is the process of gaining control or authority over another country or area. Oftentimes, this takeover is a violent one. Colonialism institutionalized the colonizers' religious traditions, their languages, their cultures, onto the indigenous people. In Latin America, the colonial era lasted about 1500s to about the 1800s. Let's check out some characteristics of the colonial era. Indigenous people suffered catastrophic losses to their populations. These losses were mainly due to violence and disease brought by Europeans. The various complex indigenous cultures and religions were wiped out by Europeans. Europeans then established their own culture, language, and religions as the new moral normal. Europeans took control over the local resources of the land and expected indigenous people to work with little, if any, pay. Europeans created their own accounts of indigenous histories and culture. Oftentimes, these accounts positioned Europeans as liberators of the indigenous people. But colonialism doesn't just end in the 1800s. The effects of colonialism are still prominent within current Latin American culture, politics, law, economics, even things like film and art. So here's the big question that I want you all to think about. What can we learn about indigenous Latin American peoples from Latin American film? While we try to answer this question, we also need to keep in mind the characteristics of the colonial era and how those might be represented in the films. Let's talk about Apocalypto, directed by Mel Gibson. I wanted to talk about this film first because I think it addresses a pretty common colonialist perspective. Apocalypto is a film about a Mayan man named Jaguar Paw, who is captured and taken to a Mayan city for human sacrifice. Jaguar Paw eventually escapes and is chased through the jungle as he tries to return to his wife and children. On the surface, Apocalypto is a well-made movie. It's full of chase scenes and high drama. There's incredible costumes and makeup, and the sets are wildly impressive. Apocalypto was even nominated for 3 Academy Awards. But viewers need to be careful here. Because the film looks really impressive, viewers might assume that it's based in accurate Mayan history. So there has been some mixed reviews by both historians and critics about how accurate Apocalypto is to historical Mayan culture. And I want to point out here that Mel Gibson is not Mayan. Now, personally, I think it is totally possible for an artist to create moving, complex, accurate art without being a part of the community that they're focusing on. However, in this context, if we consider the historical complications of colonialism, a white man creating a film about Mayan culture might raise some eyebrows. So what does Apocalypto say about Mayan people and their culture? Well, we see a lot of blood and war. Yeah, a lot of blood and war. So here's my issue with the film. I think the film focuses on the bloody parts of Mayan society while superficially addressing the overall complexity of Mayan culture. My favorite part of the film is when Jaguar Pa is being led through a Mayan city. Very quickly, we see distinct class systems, commerce, artisans, signs of complex religious traditions. We even get an idea of Mayan aesthetics and fashion. However, we only see that for maybe 2 whole minutes of the entire film. The narrative and the camera almost entirely focus on the bloody aspects of Mayan culture. Now you might be thinking, so what? That's not a big deal. And I mean, maybe you're right. Some films are just gory, and that's okay. However, if we're thinking about the characteristics of colonialism, I think we need to be a bit more critical here. If Apocalypto gives little cultural context explaining why these bloody events are happening, viewers might improperly inflate the importance of sacrifice or war in pre-colonial Mayan culture. Here's a really wild part. The film actually shows the moment the Europeans arrive, and this happens with probably like 5 minutes left of the film. At this point in the film, viewers are probably pretty exhausted. I definitely was when I was watching it. We've seen a lot of bloodshed and trauma, and I mean, Jaguar Pa is basically running for his life the entire second half of the film. Then the Europeans arrive. So after watching this film for about 2 hours and seeing cruelty and war and human sacrifice, the arrival of the Europeans might seem to viewers like a reprieve from the bloodshed and the trauma. Personally, I think the way that the Apocalypto mostly focuses on blood and war, just to end things with the Europeans' arrival, to me feels a little tactless. The idea that the Europeans delivered indigenous people from antiquated culture into civilized life is an extremely popular colonist perspective that is still around today. Let's expand our conversation here just a little bit. I noticed a few sub-themes that I wanted to talk about in relation to colonialism and indigenous experience in films. Indigenous women are discriminated against not only because of their indigeneity, but also because of their gender. Machismo is a concept in Latin American and Latinx culture that is characterized by patriarchal male dominance in society. Machismo can leave little accessibility to economic growth, social empowerment for both Indigenous and non-Indigenous women. Keep that in mind as we kind of move through these next films. Here are the films I want to talk about. Ishkanul and La Llorona, directed by Jairo Bustamante, and Roma, directed by Alfonso Cuarón. These are all great films. Please, 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 please watch them. So the first thing that I noticed about all 3 of these films is that they are about Indigenous women who lose their children. So it's not merely coincidental that 3 of the 9 films that I watched featured an Indigenous mother losing her child. Both the maternal and infant mortality rate among Indigenous women and children are much higher than non-Indigenous people. This might be because Indigenous women have harder times accessing education and healthcare. In Ishkanul, Maria lives on a rural coffee plantation with her parents, where healthcare is not accessible. In the film, Maria accidentally becomes pregnant, and then after she's bitten by a snake, the baby dies due to complications from the venom. In Roma, Cleo lives in Mexico City, and because she's employed by a doctor, she actually does have access to healthcare. However, after a traumatic experience and Cleo goes into labor, she ultimately loses her baby. Then in La Llorona, Alma loses both of her children at the hands of a genocidal military regime. In these films, Indigenous children might represent or symbolize the future of all Indigenous people. The death of Indigenous children is not just heartbreaking, but it's also a blunt uncertainty Indigenous people have about the future of their people and their cultures. Another thing I noticed in these films is that Indigenous women are pretty frequently portrayed as gatekeepers or caretakers of indigenous cultures and traditions. In La Llorona, Alma is a ghostly caretaker for the indigenous people who were murdered by a genocidal military regime. La Llorona is a Latin American folktale about a ghost who haunts young children. This folktale is often used to scare little kids into behaving. There are a bunch of different versions of the story. However, the usual features are that a young woman drowns her children and can't enter into the afterlife because she drowned her kids. She's forced to haunt the earth then as a weeping phantom while she looks for her children. Now, the origin of this folktale isn't known for sure, but it's not outrageous to assume that it might have strong roots in indigenous Latin American culture. What the film La Llorona does, that I think is entirely genius, is that it uses this folktale and takes aim at colonialism.
El general insiste en que no hubo genocidio.
Tiene 2 hijos.
¿Con quién los dejará mientras trabaja aquí?
Ya se murieron.
In the film La Llorona, Alma arrives to work at the house of a general who's being accused of genocidal war crimes against the Mayan people. Viewers very quickly begin to realize that Alma, which literally means soul or spirit in Spanish, isn't just a regular maid. As soon as she arrives, the family starts to experience some spooky stuff. The family hears ghostly weeping in the middle of the night, and the wife of the general starts to experience vivid nightmares of a woman being chased and hunted down by military officers. Ultimately, we come to find out that Alma and her children were actually victims of the general and his regime. Alma, or La Llorona, comes back then to haunt the man responsible for the death of her and her children. The film uses the story of La Llorona not to scare kids, but to avenge the countless deaths of indigenous people by the hands of the general and colonialism. In La Llorona, Alma is a ghostly champion set on getting revenge for the massacred indigenous people and their culture. I mean, that's pretty cool, right? I think that's pretty cool. So in Ishkanul, we see women as gatekeepers to the knowledge of indigenous folk medicine. Remember how we talked about healthcare being inaccessible to a majority of indigenous people, but I want to say that that's not to say that that healthcare is absent in indigenous life. Many pre-colonial indigenous cultures were actually super advanced in things like medicine, surgery, and mathematics. And the dominance of Western medicine as the only legitimate form of healing or healthcare is an effect of colonialism. In Ishkanul, Maria accidentally becomes pregnant by a man who isn't her fiance, and due to inaccessibility of healthcare to them and national Guatemalan law, Maria can't just simply get an abortion. So Maria and her mother attempt to induce an abortion before anyone finds out. Here is where viewers see the women's extensive knowledge of indigenous folk medicine. Their knowledge of indigenous medicine and healing is also probably entirely matrilineal, meaning from mother to daughter. And Ishkanul shows viewers that healthcare is not solely found in hospitals. All right, so we're gonna check out 3 films here. Eternity, directed by Oscar Catacora. Embrace of the Serpent, directed by Ciro Guerra. And I Dream in Another Language, directed by Ernesto Contreras. Now, I want you to keep in mind how colonialism might affect aging indigenous people differently. So let's start with a heartbreaker. Eternity is a rough watch. This is a film about Wilka and Foxy, an elderly indigenous couple who are living in a remote area in the Andes. This film might be best described as a slice of life film because viewers watch as Wilka and Foxy go about their day-to-day life, completing exhausting tasks as they single-handedly take care of their land. Throughout the film, the couple prays for the return of their son, who has left to go live in the city. As the film progresses, the couple experiences setback after setback. Honestly, they can't catch a break. I think their misfortune is an intentional choice by the director. I think the couple is a symbol of the aging Indigenous people who are left behind by society. And I think that their son is who never returns, by the way, might represent the hope that Indigenous people have for the return of their culture, which was stolen from them by colonization. Embrace of the Serpent is separated into two stories that are set about 30 years apart. Karamakate is the sole survivor of his tribe and the last person alive to know about a legendary sacred plant. So in both stories, he's hired by ethnographers to lead them to this plant. Embrace of the Serpent is interesting because we see Karamakate as a dynamic, idealistic young man, and then again as an older man. As an older man, it's obvious that he's worn down in a lot of ways. At one point in the film, the older Karamakate begins sobbing in his cot at night because he's afraid that he's forgotten his culture. He talks about feeling like a ghost. I think this is a real fear and anxiety for many older Indigenous people. There's ongoing social pressure for Indigenous people to leave behind their culture and conform to colonialist culture. And if they don't, they risk being forgotten or left behind. I Dream in Another Language is about the very real possibility of Indigenous cultures and languages vanishing. In I Dream in Another Language, Martin is a linguist who is hoping to save Zikriel, which is an Indigenous language in the film. There are only two people left alive who speak Zikriel, and the two men who used to be best friends refuse to speak to each other. So in the film, Martin has to mend the men's relationship and get them to work together with him to save this dying language and culture before it vanishes. This isn't just drama. Many Indigenous languages and cultures are at risk due to fewer and fewer speakers. Rates of poverty are much higher for Indigenous people than non-Indigenous people. Indigenous people often live in rural places with limited access to things like healthcare, education, and government assistance. The Indigenous people who live in cities often face discrimination and marginalization, which make it pretty tough to find jobs. So we're gonna look at two films here. We're gonna look at Motorcycle Diaries, directed by Walter Salles, and Birds of Passage, directed by Cristina Gallego and Ciro Guerra. In the Motorcycle Diaries, Ernesto Guevara is making an epic journey to see South America with his best friend. As the pair get further and further into the country, Ernesto realizes how impoverished the Indigenous people are and the inequity that they face in society. The Motorcycle Diaries is actually based off of the real-life memoirs of Ernesto, who later becomes more popularly known as Che Guevara, who was a real-life Marxist revolutionary leader. What starts basically as a gap year for Ernesto in the film quickly becomes the lifelong fight for equality.
¿Cómo es posible que sienta nostalgia por un mundo que no conocí? ¿Cómo se explica que una civilización capaz de construir esto sea arrasada para construir esto? Los incas tenían un alto conocimiento en astronomía, medicina, matemática, entre otras cosas. Pero los invasores españoles tenían la pólvora. ¿Cómo sería América hoy si las cosas hubieran sido diferentes?
Birds of Passage is a film about Indigenous people gaining economic success. Rapayet enters into the drug trade and quickly begins to prosper. Through the film, viewers watch as his family gains notoriety, wealth, and power. However, Rapayet quickly drifts further and further away from traditional Indigenous values and soon runs into some pretty major issues, like completely catastrophic issues. Interestingly enough, the person who continues to warn Rapayet that he's drifting too far away from Indigenous values is a woman, Rapayet's mother-in-law. This is another example of an Indigenous woman fulfilling the role of Indigenous caretaker. The Motorcycle Diaries and Birds of Passage are interesting to look at together. The Motorcycle Diaries shows how impoverished Indigenous people can be, while Birds of Passage shows a young Indigenous man emerging from poverty at the expense of losing touch with his Indigenous roots. So if we look at both of these films together, viewers might assume that economic success and Indigenous culture are opposing concepts, that they can't exist together. I think this assumption is entirely based in colonialism. I guess what I want to leave you with is that if we truly want to understand Indigenous people and their cultures better, we should find Indigenous films, books, music, art, and let Indigenous voices inform us about their own experiences with indigeneity and colonialism. Okay, so I think that's all I have for right now. But I do hope that you learned something, because I learned a lot while I was making this video. If you're an educator or a student watching, we have surveys for you in the description. Those help us create content that works for everyone. We also have resources available for educators, and if you're interested in learning more about those, reach out to me or visit filmstreams.org/education. Yeah, that's it. Bye.